In Boyle County, Kentucky, the Whitlow family converted their home into a funeral parlor after a cholera epidemic. For years afterward, mourners claimed the same faces appeared at multiple funerals, decades apart, never aging. Local clergy suspected fraud until the Whitlows' basement was excavated in 1873, revealing a chamber filled with sealed glass coffins. Each contained someone listed as buried in county records. The discovery was quietly suppressed. The property was later repurposed as a church rectory, where no mirrors are allowed to this day. Autumn of 1873, in the damp underbelly of a house near Danville, in the Kentucky ground that had only decades earlier been folded into Boyle County, lantern light trembled against stone and clay. The air tasted like wet lime and old wood. A mason's pick glanced off something that chimed, not like rock but like a bell buried in earth, and every shoulder in the room stopped moving at once. Silence fell with weight. The men, 2 hired diggers, a parish steward, and a Whitlow cousin with mud up to his boot tops, knelt together and pressed palm and ear to the dirt as if it might speak again. It answered with a faint, brittle squeak. They scraped with care this time, trading swing for whisper, and a pale curve emerged beneath the trowels, not stone at all but a surface that caught the lantern flame and bent it aside. Glass lives where it should not. The curve broadened, smooth and cold, revealing an ovoid faceplate sealed into a longer shape beneath a crust of tamped clay. Breath fogged the image before anyone realized they were breathing too close. It was a coffin, but not wood, not iron, not anything the men had expected to find under the Whitlows' basement. Surprise stung as sharply as fear. The parish steward crossed himself reflexively, and then checked his hand, remembering whose house this had been for nearly 40 years. A home-turned-viewing parlor when the cholera came through in the 1830s, a place of ribbons and candles and cold hands. Grief once rented the front room by the hour. Now grief blinked up like it had paid for a longer stay. They cleared the length of the thing and found it whole, a glass coffin with metal ribs sealed in pitch, the seams neat as a seamstress's hem, the surface clouded with soil and a century's worth of damp. It did not belong to any undertaker they knew. The lantern was lifted, and faces leaned over the lens in a circle of flickering light like moths troubling a window. Light revealed what they didn't want, and what they had come to find. A human face lay inches below the glass, gray, yellow in the tremor of flame. Features pinched by the work of time but uncollapsed, lips flattened, eyes closed under thin lids as if sleep had only doubled its length. Death had not been given leave to wander. Someone whispered a name that the others didn't catch, and then a different name, and then all of them fell quiet because the name sitting on the tongue felt too much like an invocation. A basement is a poor church. The steward lifted the lantern higher and traced the outline of the room with his light, noting that the coil of wall ended not in raw earth, but in a masoned arch with its mouth bricked over. Stone has a way of telling on itself. Pick and trowel did their work again, slower and cleaner, and when the arch face fell in, the air that came out was cold enough to sting. The smell was not rot so much as dust and a stiff, medicinal sweetness that made men think of winter. Beyond the arch, the chamber opened to the size of a small parlor, low ceilinged and carefully lined, its floor tamped hard, its shelves an ordered grid. The lantern light walked the rows and found the same long, pale shapes repeated. Sealed glass coffins, one after another like panes cut from the same window, set into shelves as if arranged to be chosen. The sight made throats tight. The cousin's hand shook as he lifted the nearest lid's lip of metal and found a seam that would not budge. The pitch had been poured and smoothed to perfection. There would be no opening without breaking, and no breaking without witnesses. The steward's thumb ran along a label set under the glass at the head, a tiny parchment square with a careful hand pressed against it by time and pressure. The ink had bled at the edges, but the letters still stood. A name he knew from the county ledger lay spelled out there, and below it the year and the cause: cholera. Memory, when jarred, can sound like a drawer slamming. Another lamp was fetched from the stairs and another pair of hands, and each coffin revealed a label, and each label repeated a pattern. names that should have lain in the wet earth of the churchyard across the creek. Dates that corresponded to funeral notices, causes that ran like a litany through the late 1830s. The past had been moved inside. 4 decades had not shifted these faces into dust as they should have, nor laid them to the anonymity of soil and root. Shock leaves a metallic taste. Upstairs, floorboards creaked as members of the household drifted toward the idea of what was happening below and stopped themselves at the top step, sensing a gravity they were not ready to disturb. Fear has its own etiquette. Somewhere in the hall a clock struck, muffled by walls and dirt, and the note dropped into the chamber and did not return. Time prefers straight lines until a house bends it. Men, who had buried wives and sons in the summer of the sickness, put their fingers to the glass, and did not know whether to pray or curse. The memory of carrying a box out the Whitlow's front door, suddenly replaying in a room no one had visited in years. Doubt rubbed itself against grief like 2 stones in a pocket. This was the house that would not stop receiving guests. The Whitlows used to say with gallows humor, and the phrase had haunted more than one planked wake in the years after 1838. Jokes leave footprints. Back in those days the Whitlows' rooms had run with black crepe and candle soot, chairs turned into pews, mirrors veiled or turned toward the wall to keep the soul from lingering where it was no longer welcome. The scent of boiled linens and vinegar clung like another mourner in the corner. People came and came, neighbors and relatives and strangers, whose first sight of the town was the Whitlows' shutters, the wheel ruts at the curb, the iron hitching post polished by hands. Sorrow follows the busiest road. Between the parlor and the front room the Whitlow women served coffee and stewed apples and pressed hands, moving fast and steady, always ready for one more. Some households become institutions by need. Then the rumors began, and they were small at first, as fine as a line around the mouth. And then they showed their teeth. Mourners swore the same faces, stood at different caskets years apart. No older than before, no new lines burned by the sun, no winter on their shoulders. Recognition is a disobedient thing. A farmer's wife who had buried her daughter in 39 swore she'd seen the same black, veiled woman at a neighbor's boy's laying out in 58, the dress the same cut, the gloves the same starch, the curve of the jaw identical in profile when she turned. The mind can invent patterns. The heart prefers to find them ready-made. Clergy grumbled in sermons without stating names, calling for humility in the face of trickery, suggesting that certain households had learned to profit by the trappings of grief in ways that blurred lines. Suspicion sits lightly on the righteous, but when the burying was done and the mourners went home, the Whitlows' lamps burned late, and men came quietly by the back alley with strong backs and discreet tongues, and carts creaked away toward the churchyard with a measured weight. Routine when uninterrupted wears a halo. No one reported missing coffins then. No one pulled at a shovel to check what had been covered, and the ground kept its promises until it was made to speak. Earth is a patient accomplice when asked to hold a secret. Now, in this late year, under this old house, the secret had been forced into glass and light, and names that had been scratched into the registry in a practiced hand appeared twice in the same county, once in ink, once under a lens. Paper tells one story and objects tell another. The steward asked for the ledger to be fetched, the fat book with leather sides, and a spine that cracked like a knuckle, and he opened it on a packing crate and flipped until he found the page. His finger grew heavier the farther the lists went. He read a name, held his lantern over a coffin, and read the same name again, and the room felt like it had been tilted without anyone moving. Repetition can be an accusation. Some say the parish man ordered blankets thrown over the glass. Some say he ordered a notary. Some say he blessed the room. Accounts disagree in a way that human memory always does when adrenaline wrecks its furniture. Memory is a messy archivist. What they agree on is this word never reached the town square in any official voice, and no handbills were nailed to the post office door, and no procession carried any of these sleepers out into the clean air. Sacristy is a tool sharp enough to cut its owner. The house passed into church hands within the year, according to some, and within 3 according to others, property lines drawn and redrawn in ink that looked drier than the details. Paper can disguise speed. By the time the rectory sign hung on the gate, the front parlor had been turned back toward the living, and the mirrors, so the story goes, were deliberately omitted. The walls hung instead with crosses and pastoral scenes, where faces could not find themselves twice. Reflection was treated like a leak. Visitors were told little, servants were told nothing. Priests shuttled between kitchen and chapel, with the economy of men used to hard choices and the knowledge that certain kinds of knowledge serve no one. Ignorance can be a discipline. Those who remembered the Whitlows spoke of them, in softer voices, as if to keep the family from hearing their own names in the air, and when they saw a face in town that looked too familiar, they looked away. Avoidance is a civic skill. As for the glass-lined room, tucked into clay and dressed with care and cunning, it was bricked again to the eye and perhaps to the conscience, left to whatever timetable glass and bone agree upon in the long dark. Some doors are built to be unlearned. Yet the house did not forget its profession so easily, and even as a rectory it seemed to take on a hush in the late hours. The boards breathing, the stair making the small throat, clearing sounds of a room about to be full. A building remembers what it has been asked to hold, and for decades afterward, old mourners in town swore they still saw, here and there, the same turn of a cheek at the edge of a funeral, the same gloved hand, the same eyes glistening under a veil, and swore just as quickly that they wished they had not said so. The living fear repetition when it lingers too close to the dead. In 1873, in that lantern-lit chamber, in a county that had learned how to survive and how to smooth the edge of a story, the men looked at one another and realized they had crossed from rumor into proof. Proof has a cold breath. And above their heads, the house at the corner still held open its door, as if expecting someone else at any minute, as if the bell at the gate had never quite stopped ringing. Because some houses never stop receiving guests. By the time Boyle County took its name in 1842, the story of the Whitlow house had already been written in candle smoke and cholera. The river of grief that ran through central Kentucky in 1833 needed rooms to fill. Cholera arrived on wagons and breath. It left on wagons and wheels. The disease moved faster than custom. The Whitlow house behaved like a device, not a dwelling, a wooden lung set on limestone that inhaled mourners and exhaled silence. It was built to process sorrow. Front doors opened to a corridor long enough to stage a line. Air pulled through by windows cracked high, and a chimney that never quite forgot the last fire. Flow mattered more than furniture. Rooms closest to the street became chambers of procedure, where a cooling board, a pair of trestles topped by a planed plank with drilled runnels, stood like an operating table for ritual. Wood remembered weight, ice from creekside pits or winter, cut blocks melted into tin pans beneath the board, water led away by a length of pipe that disappeared through the floor to the cistern. Cold bought a family a few more hours. The cistern itself, a brick, lined bell sunk into clay and rimmed with lime mortar, collecting rain from gutters along the eaves, fed the household and whispered a second story when disease moved with water. Purity was a theory, thirst was a fact. Limwash brightened the basement's stone walls and quieted mold. The white coat refreshed each spring with a brush that left bristles behind in corners like molted feathers. Cleanliness passed for protection even when it wasn't. A root cellar's constant chill, 50-something degrees in all weathers, sat below the parlor, its barrel vault cribbed with timber and stacked with shelves that could hold jars or, if a mind turned and a hand committed, other shapes. Temperature makes conspirators of ordinary rooms. Upstairs, mirrors veiled in crepe turned their faces to plaster, killing reflective edges that could catch a mourner's eye or a rumor's tail. Reflection was treated as a hazard. Curtains of black cloth hung on rods that could be raised and lowered in a breath, transforming ordinary spaces into sanctuaries according to the public rhythm of grief. Theatrics served mercy. The house had a back door wide enough to admit a coffin and a wagon, wheel turnaround that didn't chew the fence, a small geometry of convenience that kept neighbors from witnessing more of the procession than they needed to bear. Efficiency is a kindness until it covers something else. Tools lined a pegboard in the pantry. Planes, braces, saws, and adze for quick boxes, and as decades passed, odd items a length of gutter, percha cord for ceiling, a square of oiled silk, tins of pitch and beeswax. Every craft tells on itself. The Whitlows learned, as many undertakers did before undertakers had signs, that materials mattered. Oak swelled and sealed where pine cracked. Screw eyes held under grief's heave better than peg and loop. Linen laid flat, cotton curled when damp. Decisions became doctrine by repetition. In the late 1840s, when Almond D. Fisk's patent for a metallic burial case rippled through newspapers, cast iron shaped to the human form, hermetically sealed, with a glass plate for the face, news arrived even in Kentucky by catalog and conversation. Modernity came disguised as comfort. The Whitlows didn't need a patent to understand the appeal of glass where a face should be. Families wanted proof against rumor, and a last unimpeded look. The gaze demanded architecture. Glass in those years was expensive if broad and steady, cheaper if small and thick and slightly green, the kind poured and polished in panes that distorted just enough to make light seem wet. Imperfection made the living seem further away. A small plate the size of a man's palm could be seated in a lid with a rabbited groove, caked in putty, edged in pitch, and cinched down with iron straps drilled through and threaded with hand-cut bolts. A seal is a promise that cannot speak for itself. Pitch, pine tar thickened with rosin, thinned with heat, amended with beeswax, ran into seams when warm and sat like black glass when cold, its surface crazing with hairline maps that meant nothing if the core remained whole. Blackness looked like certainty. Gutta, percha, a rubbery gum that softened when heated and hardened when cool, came through dry goods stores by the coil after mid-century, used for canes and wire insulators and any project that required a seal that resisted water. The century liked to harden what the body insisted on softening. If the Whitlows ever had a Fisk case in their keeping, it would have been a rarity, a bright, bellied iron vessel shaped like an effigy with a plate for the face and bolts around the rim like a drum. Most families saw wood, not iron, but the idea of hermetic, a sealed world inside a box, could be adapted to wood with enough pitch and patience, with a ring of tin nailed beneath the lid and a gasket cut from leather and oiled cloth. Ingenuity is a cousin to transgression when a line shifts. Cholera itself had its own engineering, the body shedding fluid so fast the skin went cold and blue, the gut emptying to rice, water, until the pulse faltered, the eyes sinking in the skull in hours. Terrible speed forced terrible shortcuts. Miasma theory told towns to burn straw, boil vinegar, open windows, and keep the air moving, a doctrine of wind, and will that seem to chase badness with effort? The invisible had to be made to flee. Contagionists, fewer and often shouted down until later, warned hands in water carried death more faithfully than clouds did, that privies too near wells conspired in ways no prayer could amend. The earth drank what the body shed. In 1854, John Snow traced cholera in London to a pump handle, a map of black marks that made a case more compelling than a sermon, and though news of that handle traveled, belief took longer to move across fields and habits. Ideas migrate like weather. By the war years, embalming entered American parlors by way of tents and trains, with Thomas Holmes and others selling preservation in bottles, arsenic, then later formaldehyde, a chemistry of delay married to rail schedules, and the appetite of families for faces returned without insult. Delay became a product. Kentucky saw its share of new tables and glass drain jars and metal cannulas, but not every house had money for a visiting embalmer, and not every town wished to invite the smell of phenol and paint to their kitchens. Innovation waits at thresholds until the budget nods. Ice remained the old alley, placed beneath and around torsos, wrapped in cloth, lifted and changed with aching hands. The body, elevated on crossed slats, shed moisture that was caught and carried away. Cold is a cruel helper but cheap. In that tension, between air and water, between chemistry and craft, the house perfected its procedure: assign numbers, pin names, close the eyes, wrap the jaw, set the lids with copper tacks, tie the hands where the family could not see the knot. Routine softened panic. Labels were a Whitlow law, a strip of parchment or cotton card fixed under collar, or to shroud with a waxed thread. duplicated into a ledger that grew heavy and thumbed dark, names copied twice as if the second writing might guarantee the first. Redundancy made a roof over regret. The county's books used quill and iron gall. The Whitlows used pencil when it was quicker, and pencil smudges tell later fingers which lines were written in a hurry. Smear codes, urgency. Church doctrine met house doctrine at the front gate. Earth, prayer, witness, timber, pitch, name. Two systems designed to carry a person across a necessary threshold without losing them. Both claimed decency as their measure. The fear of resurrectionists, a real trade in the early decades, with medical schools hungry and graveyards undefended, lingered like a nightmare at the edge of any burial. Iron rails and vigil chairs stood a week where the dirt lay new. For some, a sealed case and a glass plate promised not only sanitation, but safety. No saw, no shovel, no hand could lift what was fastened with bolts under a face that could be counted each time a lid was visited. Ceiling comforted both superstition and caution. The basement's arch, when uncovered, showed the mind of a mason, a low barrel roof of brick set in lime, the bond even, Vassars tight, the corner turned with care where the shelf met the curve. Craft does not choose its subject. Shelves ran at measured intervals, equal height to accommodate a standard length. The human body's stubborn average, and rail lips kept cases from sliding in damp seasons when clay swelled. Gravity was negotiated. Vent holes near the ceiling, small, round, and blacked over, suggested an attempt to control what little drift of air a subterranean room allowed. Their mouths faced away from the street to trade secrecy for breath. A chamber cannot hold air and stories without leaking one of them. Pitch seams along glass rims bore fingerprints fossilized in black, the walls pressed by a hand that rolled and smoothed, where the pot buzzed with heat a few feet away. Touch leaves its signature when time intends to find it later. Wax dribbles, white, then animal yellow, mapped where candles once were set along a ledge to allow inspection without flare. The soot licked toward a low ceiling that had been wiped more than once, leaving ovular clean patches like halos. Light obeyed discipline. The doctrine of the rectory, once the house changed hands, read differently on the same wood. No mirrors to invite repetition, plain cross where a portrait might linger, doors that close softly, but entirely between the public and the private. New rules rode old hinges. The priest's practice kept records in a different book, with a different script, and in the margin of at least one entry a neat, unassuming hand wrote the interment recorded as per family, location as declared. Language can be armor when it needs to be. If the chamber was left intact, and the story says it was bricked again beyond the touch of ordinary days, then it became a system without operators, a mechanism whose gears were sealed, the house breathing above a stillness that no liturgy could resolve. Dormant machines keep their character. It is the nature of devices to outlast the people who built them, especially when made of plain materials used plainly: brick, lime, timber, iron, glass, pitch, each obedient to weather and time in known ways. Obedience can hide a transgression perfectly. And so the Whitlow house's character emerges not as villain or saint, but as apparatus, a construction that disciplined motion and managed sight, in order to deliver the living from a crisis they could not solve, and the dead to a destination some of them did not reach. Purpose can slide while the process remains beautiful. Down in the arched room, beneath limewash and labels, beneath names that matched other names in other books, the sealant still glints a little when a lamp is raised, as if remembering heat. Memory likes to shine through its thinnest places. And above, in the rooms that learned to forbid reflection, boards still creak on the same notes, where mourners once stood in rows, the house continuing to work the way it was taught even after its occupation changed. Machines keep habits even when their operators repent. Families learned a new vocabulary overnight. Miasma, contagion, quarantine, words spoken like charms and worn thin by repetition. The taste of vinegar clung to lips. In Danville and the farms that fed it, people died in the span of a day, sometimes in hours, and the old habit of home laying out collapsed under the press of numbers and the speed of loss. The parlor could not keep up. The Whitlows were carpenters by trade and kin to masons, with a house set near the road and a yard broad enough for wagons to turn without falling neighbors' fences. Position becomes purpose when the town is bleeding. They draped their front rooms in black crepe, set cooling boards across trestles, and borrowed chairs from half the street, until the chairs themselves felt like mourners. The clock on the mantel wore a shawl. Neighbors came because that is what neighbors did before there were undertakers and parlors with brass plates and names on the door. The air smelt of lye and coffee. Candles guttered and flared as doors opened and closed, and the Whitlow women moved like steady shadows among the living and the dead, straightening linen and pinching wicks, whispering to children who did not understand why sound had to be smaller now. Smallness of sound keeps shape in a room full of absence. Men carried bodies out the front gate to carts bound for churchyards that had never expected to be busy. Wheels made grooves the rain could not erase. In the first weeks they did what everyone did. Wooden coffins hammered in the yard, lids screwed down tight, burials done at haste with prayers that tripped over themselves. Speed trumped ceremony and left a taste like metal. Then survival turned into practice, and practice turned into custom. Custom leaves deep ruts. The Whitlows began to keep records, because someone had to. Names were written in a careful hand on slips pinned to collars and copied into a ledger that swelled with paper and grease and tear-stained corners. They took sums for coffins and cloth and candles, never enough to justify the hours. Money slides off grief like rain off oilskin. The town adjusted around the new axis. The house that took people in at the end, and a dozen black veils that hung permanently on pegs just inside the door. Veils feel like weather when worn often. It was in those years the first superstitions set their hooks, born of fear and repetition and the human tendency to make pattern where pattern seems to shimmer. A shimmer takes on weight if seen enough. Mirrors were veiled, as they often were in mourning, to keep the soul from catching sight of itself and lingering. And clocks were stopped, a gesture toward the belief that time should pause when someone who had held a portion of it released their share. Even furniture felt obligated to bow. Children were kept away from windows lest their reflection slip and forget which side to return to. A house learns to hunch around its own rumors. The Whitlows were practical, and practicality in those decades looked like superstition from the outside. Windows opened wide even in winter, vinegar boiled, salt scattered at thresholds, straw burned in the yard to scare away the bad air. Miasma theory hung in the air as surely as smoke. Then came a calmer decade, and then another wave in '49, and the Whitlow house stood its post again, as if the lull had only been a breath between sobs. When grief returns, it expects the old chair to be in the old corner. By the late 1840s, a new invention drifted westward through newspapers and catalogues. The metallic burial case with a glass viewing plate over the face. A sealed coffin that promised sanitation and dignity in one. The admin called it modern, the preachers called it caution masquerading as vanity. Sealed meant safe in a century that feared not only contagion but premature burial, a dread as old as soft earth and shallow graves. Bells and strings hung in imagination from caskets, even when cost and comfort kept them away from most homes. The Whitlows saw the advertisements, saw the fear, and saw the expectations of families who wanted to look one last time without touching. The gaze needs somewhere to rest. They acquired what they could: metal cases with glass faceplates, wooden coffins with glazed panels, pitch and putty and the tools to make a seem more honest than air. Honesty was a craft more than a virtue in rooms like these. When the war years came and went, embalming made a noisy entrance in army camps and railroad stations, the dead traveling home on schedules that demanded chemistry. Even in Kentucky, embalming tables showed up in barns and back rooms like strange altars. But embalming cost money and required materials not every household could find, and Danville's habits bent slowly rather than snapped. Old ways don't surrender without terms. By then the Whitlow house had become more than a family address. It was an institution with a known smell, a known cadence, a known corridor in the mind that people walked when they needed to brace themselves. Familiarity has architecture. This was when the other pattern began to be whispered, the pattern of faces that did not change. The whisper had teeth. A tall man with a black armband and a slight hitch in his step, seen in 38 at the laying out of a woman from Maple Avenue, seen again in 58 at the wake for a boy who drowned in a mill race, seen in 71 standing near the stove as if the heat did not touch him at all. Memory notices a limp more than a name. A woman veiled so thoroughly that only the angle of her jaw could be glimpsed when she turned, her gloves always bone, white, her hands empty and folded at the belly, present at 3 funerals by 3 generations telling. The same fold, the same stillness, the same refusal to sit. A boy whose hair lay too neat for a child, who never fidgeted, who stood as if listening for someone outside the room. In stories he always asked no questions and answered none. Children in rooms of grief teach adults to believe. Sometimes these were the Whitlows themselves, going about the work that made them visible and anonymous at once. Sometimes they were someone else, someone never introduced and never thanked. An absence that occupied space. Clergy watched the house with a mixed gaze, grateful for its service, suspicious of its centrality, wary of its small economies. The church prefers to own the threshold to the next room. Sermons began to include generalities about sober dealing after death, about the danger of letting commerce touch the moment when the heart is forsaken. The pulpit can soothe and sting in the same sentence. Behind closed doors, suspicion grew sharper. Men in collars asked questions in kitchens about whether fees matched services, whether burials were properly recorded, whether anyone had gone to check the depth of earth over certain plots in the churchyard. Questions have a way of looking for a ledger before a witness. The county kept its books in broad, cracking volumes, births, deaths, marriages, ink that went brown with the years and crumbled at the edges where fingers had worried them. The Whitlows kept their own ledger too, fat with receipts and names and times. 2 sets of records can be a comfort. They can also be a knife. The gap between them whispers. When 1873 brought another season of sickness and repairs were needed at the old house. A settling wall, a cistern that leaked into the cellar, a new beam to carry weight. Hands went down into the clay and touched glass. Earth made the first introduction. What they found was not simply a hidden room but a hidden order, a deliberate arrangement that had required time and labor, and a belief that the basement could be made to hold what the ground was meant to keep. Order is always an accusation when discovered in a place of supposed chaos. There were labels under glass, names that matched the county book, entries that declared buried, when these faces had lain instead in a chamber bricked over and left to the dark. Ink and pitch had conspired. The explanations available to the practical mind lined up quickly. Perhaps a fear of contagion had kept bodies away from consecrated ground. Perhaps fees had been taken twice and duties performed once. Perhaps some among the Whitlows had believed they were preserving loved ones against the cruelty of decay until a safer day. A practical mind is a tireless machine when pressed. But against these marched the other knowledge of sightings and supposed sightings, of faces that did not age, of a house that seemed to insist on repetition. The heart makes its own evidence when the facts are thin and bright. The clergy, forced into the cellar to own what lay in their parish, faced what they feared in 2 directions at once. Authority dislikes mirrors even more than houses do. To the town they owed calm, to the ledger they owed accuracy, and to their own souls they owed an answer as to whether this was crime or caution, sacrilege or science, fraud or misplaced mercy. Words fail precisely when needed most. What they could do, they did quietly. Quiet is a form of violence when used against truth. The chamber was recorded in a hand that no one later wanted to claim, and decisions were made in rooms where the curtains were shut at midday. Dust thickened on sunlight that wasn't allowed to land. The property slid out of family hands into church hands on a transaction that looked simple if you didn't consider the weight behind the ink. Prices flatten more than they reveal. By the time the sign was changed and the rooms were reappointed, a rule had already been settled: no mirrors. Reflection, once implicated, was banished like a disfavored relative. To parishioners, it was explained as humility, as avoidance of vanity, as a preference for plainness in a house set aside for work and sleep and prayer. A small lie is safer than a large truth in whispers. The reason was less neat, that the living should not catch sight of what could not grow older in a place that had been taught to keep faces. The house had a memory. Glass made it visible. For those who had carried coffins out the front gate in the old days, the change felt like a chapter break written without warning. Chapters close with a click only the careful can hear. Some older men in town suggested that the dead had been kept away from sacred ground to spare the congregation from the return of disease. Others suggested darker economies, their voices going hoarse at the end of thought. The Whitlows themselves faded, as families do when the work that defined them is taken away, leaving behind a name that people did not want to speak near their mouths. Reputation evaporates faster than sweat. What remained was the house and its habits, the road and its grooves, the churchyard and its stones, and a chamber under the floor that knew a different roster than the one under the grass. The land held 2 books, and in that split, between official entry and secret shelf, between the comfort of explanation and the sting of the uncanny, the town found a balance it could live with. Survival prefers ambiguity when certainty bruises. You can still feel the carefulness when you step onto those old boards, even now. If you find yourself in a place like it, the reluctance of wood to echo, the determined plainness of a wall where a mirror might naturally hang, the hush that goes deeper than politeness. Rooms acquire instincts like people do, and so the stage was set a family whose practicality outlived its welcome, a town with a long memory for patterns, a church trying to straddle doctrine and dread, and beneath it all a sealed geometry of glass and names. The quiet did not mean peace, it meant preparation. The Whitlow house behaved like a device, not a dwelling, a wooden lung set on limestone that inhaled mourners and exhaled silence. It was built to process sorrow. Front doors opened to a corridor long enough to stage a line, air pulled through by windows cracked high, and a chimney that never quite forgot the last fire. Flow mattered more than furniture. Rooms closest to the street became chambers of procedure, where a cooling board, a pair of trestles topped by a plain plank with drilled runnels, stood like an operating table for ritual. Wood remembered weight. Ice from creekside pits or winter, cut blocks melted into tin pans beneath the board, water led away by a length of pipe that disappeared through the floor to the cistern. Cold bought a family a few more hours. The cistern itself, a brick, lined bell sunk into clay and rimmed with lime mortar, collecting rain from gutters along the eaves, fed the household and whispered a second story when disease moved with water. Purity was a theory, thirst was a fact. Limwash brightened the basement's stone walls and quieted mold. The white coat refreshed each spring with a brush that left bristles behind in corners like molted feathers. Cleanliness passed for protection even when it wasn't. A root cellar's constant chill, 50-something degrees in all weathers, sat below the parlor, its barrel vault cribbed with timber, and stacked with shelves that could hold jars or, if a mind turned and a hand committed, other shapes. Temperature makes conspirators of ordinary rooms. Upstairs, mirrors veiled in crepe turned their faces to plaster, killing reflective edges that could catch a mourner's eye or a rumor's tale. Reflection was treated as a hazard. Curtains of black cloth hung on rods that could be raised and lowered in a breath, transforming ordinary spaces into sanctuaries, according to the public rhythm of grief. Theatric served mercy. The house had a back door wide enough to admit a coffin and a wagon, wheel turnaround that didn't chew the fence, a small geometry of convenience that kept neighbors from witnessing more of the procession than they needed to bear. Efficiency is a kindness until it covers something else. Tools lined a pegboard in the pantry, planes braces, saws and adze for quick boxes, and, as decades passed, odd items a length of gutter, percha cord for ceiling, a square of oiled silk, tins of pitch and beeswax. Every craft tells on itself. The Whitlows learned, as many undertakers did before undertakers had signs, that materials mattered. Oak swelled and sealed where pine cracked. Screw eyes held under grief's heave better than peg and loop. Linen laid flat, cotton curled when damp. Decisions became doctrine by repetition. In the late 1840s, when Almond D. Fissick's patent for a metallic burial case rippled through newspapers, cast iron shaped to the human form, hermetically sealed with a glass plate for the face. News arrived even in Kentucky by catalog and conversation. Modernity came disguised as comfort. The Whitlows didn't need a patent to understand the appeal of glass where a face should be. Families wanted proof against rumor, and a last unimpeded look. The gaze demanded architecture. Glass in those years was expensive if broad and steady, cheaper if small and thick and slightly green, the kind poured and polished in panes that distorted just enough to make light seem wet. Imperfection made the living seem further away. A small plate the size of a man's palm could be seated in a lid with a rabbited groove, caked in putty, edged in pitch, and cinched down with iron straps drilled through and threaded with hand-cut bolts. A seal is a promise that cannot speak for itself. Pitch, pine tar thickened with rosin, thinned with heat, amended with beeswax, ran into seams when warm and sat like black glass when cold, its surface crazing with hairline maps that meant nothing if the core remained whole. Blackness looked like certainty. Gutta, percha, a rubbery gum that softened when heated and hardened when cool, came through dry goods stores by the coil after mid-century, used for canes and wire insulators, and any project that required a seal that resisted water. The century liked to harden what the body insisted on softening. If the Whitlows ever had a fist case in their keeping, it would have been a rarity. A bright, bellied iron vessel shaped like an effigy with a plate for the face and bolts around the rim like a drum. Most families saw wood, not iron, but the idea of hermetic, a sealed world inside a box, could be adapted to wood with enough pitch and patience, with a ring of tin nailed beneath the lid and a gasket cut from leather and oiled cloth. Ingenuity is a cousin to transgression. When a line shifts, cholera itself had its own engineering, the body shedding fluid so fast the skin went cold and blue, the gut emptying to rice water, until the pulse faltered, the eyes sinking in the skull in hours. Terrible speed forced terrible shortcuts. Miasma theory told towns to burn straw, boil vinegar, open windows, and keep the air moving. A doctrine of wind and will that seem to chase badness with effort. The invisible had to be made to flee. Contagionists, fewer and often shouted down until later. Warned hands and water carried death more faithfully than clouds did. That privies too near wells conspired in ways no prayer could amend. The earth drank what the body shed. In 1854, John Snow traced cholera in London to a pump handle, a map of black marks that made a case more compelling than a sermon, and though news of that handle traveled, belief took longer to move across fields and habits. Ideas migrate like weather. By the war years, embalming entered American parlors by way of tents and trains, with Thomas Holmes and others selling preservation in bottles, arsenic, then later formaldehyde, a chemistry of delay married to rail schedules, and the appetite of families for faces returned without insult. Delay became a product. Kentucky saw its share of new tables and glass drain jars and metal cannulas, but not every house had money for a visiting embalmer, and not every town wished to invite the smell of phenol and paint to their kitchens. Innovation waits at thresholds until the budget nods. Ice remained the old ally, placed beneath and around torsos, wrapped in cloth, lifted and changed with aching hands. The body, elevated on crossed slats, shed moisture that was caught and carried away. Cold is a cruel helper but cheap. In that tension, between air and water, between chemistry and craft, the house perfected its procedure: assign numbers, pin names, close the eyes, wrap the jaw, set the lids with copper tacks, tie the hands where the family could not see the knot. Routine softened panic. Labels were a Whitlow law, a strip of parchment or cotton card fixed under collar, or to shroud with a waxed thread, duplicated into a ledger that grew heavy and thumb dark, names copied twice as if the second writing might guarantee the first. Redundancy made a roof over regret. The county's books used quill and iron gall. The Whitlows used pencil when it was quicker, and pencil smudges tell later fingers which lines were written in a hurry. Smear codes urgency. Church doctrine met house doctrine at the front gate. Earth, prayer, witness, timber, pitch, name. Two systems designed to carry a person across a necessary threshold without losing them. Both claimed decency as their measure. The fear of resurrectionists. A real trade in the early decades, with medical schools hungry and graveyards undefended. lingered like a nightmare at the edge of any burial. Iron rails and vigil chairs stood a week where the dirt lay new. For some, a sealed case and a glass plate promised not only sanitation but safety. No saw, no shovel. No hand could lift what was fastened with bolts under a face that could be counted each time a lid was visited. Ceiling comforted both superstition and caution. The basement's arch, when uncovered, showed the mind of a mason, a low barrel roof of brick set in lime, the bond even, voussoirs tight, the corner turned with care where the shelf met the curve. Craft does not choose its subject. Shelves ran at measured intervals, equal height to accommodate a standard length, the human body's stubborn average, and rail lips kept cases from sliding in damp seasons when clay swelled. Gravity was negotiated. Vent holes near the ceiling, small, round, and blacked over, suggested an attempt to control what little drift of air a subterranean room allowed. Their mouths faced away from the street to trade secrecy for breath. A chamber cannot hold air and stories without leaking one of them. Pitch seams along glass rims bore fingerprints fossilized in black, the holes pressed by a hand that rolled and smoothed, where the pot buzzed with heat a few feet away. Touch leaves its signature when time intends to find it later. Wax dribbles, white, then animal, yellow, mapped where candles once were set along a ledge to allow inspection without flare. The soot licked toward a low ceiling that had been wiped more than once, leaving ovular clean patches like halos. Light obeyed discipline. The doctrine of the rectory, once the house changed hands, read differently on the same wood. No mirrors to invite repetition, plain cross where a portrait might linger, doors that close softly, but entirely between the public and the private. New rules rode old hinges. The priest's practice kept records in a different book, with a different script, and in the margin of at least one entry a neat, unassuming hand wrote intimate recorded as per family, location as declared. Language can be armor when it needs to be, if the chamber was left intact, and the story says it was, bricked again beyond the touch of ordinary days. Then it became a system without operators, a mechanism whose gears were sealed, the house breathing above a stillness that no liturgy could resolve. Dormant machines keep their character. It is the nature of devices to outlast the people who built them, especially when made of plain materials used plainly. Brick, lime, timber, iron, glass, pitch, each obedient to weather and time in known ways. Obedience can hide a transgression perfectly, and so the Whitlow house's character emerges not as villain or saint, but as apparatus, a construction that disciplined motion and managed sight in order to deliver the living from a crisis they could not solve, and the dead to a destination some of them did not reach. Purpose can slide while the process remains beautiful. Down in the arched room, beneath limewash and labels, beneath names that matched other names in other books, the sealant still glints a little when a lamp is raised, as if remembering heat. Memory likes to shine through its thinnest places. And above, in the rooms that learn to forbid reflection, boards still creak on the same notes, where mourners once stood in rows, the house continuing to work the way it was taught even after its occupation changed. Machines keep habits even when their operators repent. September 14, 1871. A hot evening laid over Danville like a damp cloth, and the Whitlow front room breathed candle heat and black cloth, while a miller's boy lay on a plank under a linen sheet. The parlor had learned how to swallow sound. A tall man with a black armband and a slight hitch in his step stood near the mantel, still as a portrait, his eyes not on the boy but on the door. Familiarity can sting harder than grief. Two old men on the back bench nudged one another, the nudge of men who had outlived many processions and trusted their own recollection more than a deacon's. Memory tests itself in company. "That same fellow," one whispered, his breath coffee sour, "stood at my sister's Hannah's laying, out in 38. Same cut of coat, same limp." The other did not answer, he only watched the man's hands. When the hymn ended and the mourners broke into currents, the two men tracked the limping stranger toward the narrow passage by the pantry, watched him turn into shadow, and then lost him in a house, whose angles they should have known better than any child. Houses can hide those who have permission to be hidden. They told the curate, A young man with ink on his cuffs and earnestness, worn thin by steady sorrow, and he nodded as men nod at gnats. Skepticism is a virtue until it dulls a warning. He wrote nothing down. 2 years and a winter later. A first frost slicked the stones in the yard and curled the garden's last leaves to paper. The house requested repairs without voice by the simple sag of a beam. Open the wall and shore the rise, the parish steward said. His hand settled on the arithmetic of it, not the rumor. Men who keep books prefer problems that can be measured. On October 9, 1873, the arch fell in, and the lantern light went into a chamber that had been designed to hate lanterns. Discovery is not the same as understanding. There were names under glass, and the air walked out of the hole like a cold animal. The men stepped back by instinct. The curate was no longer a curate but the rector, Collinshire, born, careful in speech, hands that liked the feel of leather spines, and if the moment asked for a sermon, he did not give one. Rhetoric recalls from glass. Instead he sent for the county ledger, and the churchyard key, and the sheriff whose badge meant he could insist without screaming. Authority arrived with 3 pairs of boots, and a silence it pretended was composure. They picked one name from the labels, not at random but because it was familiar to everyone in the room. Margaret Ann Tolliver, 1833, Cholera. It is easier to begin with a woman the town had loved. The sheriff agreed because he remembered the Tolliver farm's shade and the pitcher of water that had appeared in his hand on a July afternoon. Memory makes justice personal. They took notes in pencil because ink takes too long to dry. From the Rector's Journal, 10th of October 1873, I asked that we take one case and no more to avoid a parade. We chose Tolliver. I prayed under my breath and was embarrassed by the sound of it. The cemetery lay damp in its low places, the grass brass, gold where the sun hit it and black where it didn't. Stones leaned the way people do when they are tired of standing upright. They found the Tolliver plot by habit more than inscription, the names wearing off at the speed of bad weather. The sheriff took off his coat, as if that would make him neutral. Spades bit and slid, and the laborers worked a practiced rhythm, each slice a syllable, each throw a clause, the grave sentence being rewritten from the top down. Earth had given up what it held before. This time it hesitated. They hit plank sooner than a man expects when the ground is honest, the wood dull under dirt, no hollow ring. Relief came too quickly. The sheriff ordered care with the nails, and the rector looked anywhere but at the lid. Avoidance is a posture with its own spine. When they lifted the top, the smell that came up was not rot but damp wood and metal, the clean scent of things that have preferred air to flesh. Odors teach even without permission. They held their breath anyway. Inside lay stones, river smooth, gray and brown, stacked with care, as if weight could argue for decency. The arrangement felt like an apology that did not include the victim. No bone, no cloth, no stain that spoke of a human passage from one room to another, only ballast. The sheriff's face learned a new stillness. From the statement of Sheriff Ambrose Tinsley, filed privately and never read in court, I saw a coffin opened in the presence of Reverend Whitfield, Mr. Bramlett, and 2 laborers. Content stones, 12 or more, ranging in size from a man's fist to a loaf, none marked, lid well made, nails old. I marked each man's hand with dirt, and kept mine cleaner than I liked. The rector's hand shook as he set down the lantern, and opened the county ledger to the page where Margaret Ann Tolliver's name lay in a careful hand. Ink pretends it is enough. Buried, it said, and below that a date, and a pastor's signature that had belonged to a man now in his own piece of ground. The page did not blush. They closed the coffin with the respect given to a mistaken door and refilled the grave, because the earth did not earn blame today. Gravity takes what it is given without comment. Back at the house, the chamber did not care for their return. The air in it felt like the inside of a blown-out egg. The rector insisted on a second test, because men who fear facts try to defeat them by repeating them until the shape becomes familiar. Familiarity is a poor antidote to guilt. They chose a child's name this time, James Fletcher, 6 years, 1833, and repeated the ritual in the churchyard, spade and plank and grey light. Patterns double faster when they involve the small. Empty again, not in a way that sounded like emptiness, but looked like it. No bones, no shroud, no pin. Only a small wooden cross nailed to the underside of the lid, as if the carpenter had hoped God could read from that position. Faith had been asked to serve forgery. The sheriff coughed into his hand and left the hand clenched a long time. In the house, a face under glass bore a label that matched the child's name. The letters crowded by a later hand's flourish, as if someone had retraced them to make sure they would never fade. Redundancy leaves grooves. From the rector's journal. I find the glass more offensive than any other thing, not because of the vessel, but because of the intimacy it compels. To look is to confess that I am part of this seeing. He had Mrs. Fletcher sent for, and when she arrived, he wished immediately that he had not, because asking a mother to verify a face under a lens is a cruelty dressed as caution. Clergy sometimes wear scissors without knowing. She put her palm to the glass, and then removed it and saw the print she had made and said a word that was not a prayer. Grief does not always consent to piety. That is his mouth, she said, and then, very softly, and that is his hair at the cowlick. The room felt smaller than it had been an hour before. A mason named Silas Hodges had been hired to shore the arch and watched all of this with the long patience of a man who knew the shapes of rooms and of lies. A craft teaches you which angles are honest. He spoke once, not to the rector but to the glass. Whoever did this worked evenings, he said, when the wood would not swell and the pitch would sit. They kept the surfaces clean. They loved the work. Love can turn in wrong directions without losing its grace. The sheriff asked him to be quiet because the sentence had too many truths in it. They looked for an easier theory, fear of contagion, perhaps, that had kept bodies from crowded ground, a family's request honored in the quiet, a plan for later reburial that had lost its calendar, and then its courage. Easier theories put hands on shoulders and walk a man out of a room he should be forced to remain in. But the ledger did not accommodate these comforts. The names in the county book had been entered as completed ritual, and coins had been taken, and prayers said over emptiness. From a slip of paper found in the Whitlows' private ledger, undated, paid in full, Cholera, for coffin cloth, candles, carriage, digging. Noti family insisted on glass. Noti rain. Noti boys watching from fence. In the chamber, along the second shelf, a woman's face lay composed with care, her jawline unmistakable, even without the thin black creep that had habitually cloaked it. Recognition has a shape more powerful than a name. One of the old men from the back bench, brought down now, because someone thought a witness should look at his own story, stood in the doorway and took one step in, and then stopped as if the floor were heated. He did not have enough words left in his life for this. Here, he said, with no verb to help him, because the verb would have been, stood, and the noun lay. The rector tried to bring order by bringing procedure list, number, marked diagram, a modest mapping of a room that did not want to be mapped. Order can be a bandage. He asked for a mirror for the sake of light, a simple expedient, and the steward refused without raising his voice. Rules had already been drafted without the rector's consent. No mirrors, the steward said. Not in this house. Not now. Prohibition grows faster than explanation. From the diary of Reverend Whitfield, last entry of that week. I was angry at being managed and relieved to be managed and hated myself for both. I wrote to the bishop and did not send the letter. I wrote a sermon and burned it. I put a cross in a place where a mirror would have asked me to see. They broke one glass because the law warranted a sample, and the stomachs of men could take only so much of staring. Breaking is a form of knowledge. The crack ran like ice under a boot, neat at first and then jagged, and the scent that sighed out was not death, but the leftovers of preservation. Pitch, beeswax, something like winter apples forgotten in a loft. The room breathed with them as if consenting. The face did not shatter. It lay exactly as it had lain. Lashes stuck in a clump like old paintbrush bristles, hair matted to the skin at the temples where a mother's hand would have smoothed it daily in life. Detail kills doubt. The sheriff's affidavit ended with a sentence that looked tame and bit at the ankle hours later. Conclusion: Bodies present in basement correspond to records marked buried in county book. Conclude also that graves inspected tuve contained stones and no remains. They sealed the broken case with wool blankets because they did not know what else to do. Improvisation is decency's last tool. Outside, the bell on the Whitlow gate swung when no one touched it, a trick of an evening wind, a sound that the house recognized without needing to be told the hour. Habits survive even when customs die. Inside, men who had prided themselves on discernment, on knowing the thickness of a lie by the sound it made under a knuckle, stood in a row like penitents and understood that for years they had spoken certainty into a room that had been taking notes. Arrogance behaves like armor until it cracks, and when the last lantern was lowered close to the second shelf, there was nothing left that anyone in that room could call rumor, only a face under glass that had stood beside 3 caskets over 3 decades by every account, and never once changed. The disbelief did not protect them. What lay under the churchyard had been stones. What lay under the house had been people. The morning after the second empty coffin was found, the rector convened a meeting in the dining room, where the sunlight fell in a well, behaved square, and the smell of coffee could almost pass for courage. Paper and china steadied trembling hands. Minutes of the parish committee, 12th of October 1873, resolved that the chamber be secured, the discovery noted in internal record, and public scandal averted for the sake of souls. The pen scratched like a small animal in a trap. Silas Hodges was asked to brick the arch, but not with the same brick. He was told to use Portland cement and a harder bake, to bind clay to stone like a secret stitched into a seam. Mortar set while breath held. He gouged sand, slaked lime, and water by feel and ear the way good masons do, and butted the joints until the trowel sang against brick. The ring of steel sounded too bright underground. They left 2 small weep holes high under the lip of the vault, where the wall met the floor joists, camouflaged behind the whitewash, the mouths facing inward so that damp might be managed without letting eyes in. Air was rationed like a confession. The sheriff wrote one last note and folded it into a paper envelope he sealed with wax, and he put the envelope in a drawer he locked, and he put the key somewhere he would forget until he needed it. Secrets love furniture. Reverend Whitfield's Journal, 14th October 1873. I have prayed for the right to speak plain and been denied. I have been given the duty to tend the living, and I will not abandon it. Therefore the chamber will be left as is. The dead there are no more helped by light. The page smelled faintly of smoke where a candle guttered. The Whitlows receded with speed that suggested premeditation and shame dressed as prudence, the last of them settling a bill with a curt nod and hitching a team before breakfast. Wheels made a careful noise. By winter the deed had changed hands, and the house had become a rectory overnight in the polite fiction that things change cleanly if the paper does. Politeness coats rough grain. Rules posted by the scullery door took the place of a prayer. No mirrors hung within, no polished copper left bright enough to reflect, no glass aside from panes already installed in windows. Shine was suspect, like a stranger who lingers. They trained the household to see without seeing. Faces were to be met by voice, not glance. Doors closed gently to keep echoes from sounding like steps. Candle stubs were kept short, so that flames would not throw silhouettes that looked like returning guests. The rectory educated sound and light. In town, families adapted too, because fear makes engineers of us all. Custom stiffened its back. Pallbearers began to insist on bearing the coffin all the way to open ground, and standing until the last spade of dirt hissed onto the lid. The sound of soil became an absolution. Mothers asked to mark the inside of lids. Tiny crosses burned in with a needle heated over a lamp, so that if doubt ever returned, the symbol could testify. Faith accepted a hidden courtroom. A carpenter from just beyond the Stanford Road offered a new kind of fastener for turn screws instead of nails, so the family could see them tightened and count them, and remember the number through the fog of grief. Counting is a crutch that works. Some brought in their own bell strings, old folklore resurrected overnight, tying a light cord to a finger and lacing it up through a vent hole to a tiny bell on a twig. so that the superstition could guard against a failure of breath mistaken for death. The night wind made music in new places. The county clerk, whose ink had fed on names for decades, added a column to a ledger without asking anyone. Witness to burial present. YN. A small letter Y became a talisman. There were numbers no one liked to speak, but kept in their heads regardless. 20. Odd faces under glass by first count, then 31 by second, then a settled 30, 2 by the third. Careful walk with 2 lanterns. The glow made the glass soak. Of those, the rector's quiet cross reference found 20, 8 with exact matches in the county record as buried, 3 marked as removed to family plot, without detail, and 1 unentered anywhere except the Whitlow ledger with a notation in pencil that sank like a stone. No fee. The last line smelled like pitch even in memory. Dread did what dread always does. It multiplied in closed rooms and nested in the hollow where certainty should live. Houses gave it space. People reported the limping man again, the veiled woman again, the 2 still boy again, at the Methodist funeral in January, at the Baptist wake in March, at a farmer's home where the coffin rested on sources longer than anyone wanted because the ground was still iron. Patterns hang like fog in low places. Letters carried the new caution beyond Boyle County, in the looping hands of sisters and cousins who posted warnings like homely scripture. Ink ferried worry through winter, from a letter by S.P. to her sister in Harrodsburg, 22 for January 1874. They say the rectory does not allow mirrors at all because a face once stayed too long in one, and I have decided to cover ours when guests are in the house, lest someone's sorrow think it is invited to remain. The wax seal cracked like a knuckle. A doctor whose Latin was better than his poetry wrote a short piece for the local paper, in which he explained putrefaction and the mercies of ice and the efficacy of lime and the impossible foolishness of glass cases on moral grounds. Reason can be shriller than fear when it wishes to be heard. He was invited to the rectory for coffee and left sober, a man who had visited a museum that was not open to the public, coffee cooled without being finished. Behind the closed doors of the parish office, adaptations took on a clerical tone. Policy grew as moss does, quietly and everywhere. A new set of forms bore small boxes for unusual variables, requested glass, embalming, private viewing, transport, and a line for certificate of interment observed. Bureaucracy built a fence out of ticks. When families insisted on a last look, the rector honored it, but not in that house. He chose the side chapel where the light was poor, and the windows were high, and the distance between the pew and the door was mercifully short. The chapel kept secrets like a good pocket. The masons returned in spring to plaster and lime-wash the basement, and to inscribe on the brick, in letters small as fingerprints, the year of the sealing, as if the date itself could guard like a prayer. Tiny numbers looked like stitches. Silas Hodges left one note in his daybook, that winter which became a kind of signature for the whole affair without intending to be. I thought to take down the arch and I built it up instead. Doing the opposite of a thing takes the same skill. Pencil smudged into the page grain. Not all countermeasures were physical. Some worked on the mind. Children were taught to look at boots and hands, and to describe those rather than faces if asked later. Details that age honestly, not contours that might trouble a mother's eye when memory returns. The young learned a new arithmetic of recognition. Men who prided themselves on recalling a man's gait and weight now distrusted their own senses, and they spoke of the limping man with a humor that was too loud to be easy. Laughter chased shadows from corners and failed. In a few households, older pictures were turned to the wall or slid behind newer ones, not for modesty but for fear that one face might match another too well across years and force a conclusion no one could live with. Familiarity became an accusation in oak frames. A widow from Perryville refused to let her husband's coffin pass the Whitlow gate on its way to church, insisting the procession detour along a rutted lane and cross a flooded creek rather than walk past the house that had kept too many. Mud climbed the hems of black skirts like another mourner. From Sheriff Tinsley's pocket notebook, undated, written between 2 lists of saddle repairs. I can hear that gate bell when I try to sleep. I have put my hand on every stone I could reach in our yard. I want my palm to know what lies under it. The leather smelled of sweat and rain. Spring brought warmth and a rash of small fevers. The doctor made house calls with his case smelling of carbolic, and the rectory kept its door, always ajar policy when the bell pulled. Practice became armor again, yet anyone who had stood in the chamber, even once, even for a breath, found that the living rooms above had changed pitch. Footfalls sounded suspect. From Reverend Whitfield's journal, 3rd of May 1874, I have placed a cross in the hole where a mirror hung in the Whitlows' time. Parishioners remark on the plainness. I answer that our faces are for the Lord to see and our deeds for the ledger. This satisfies most, and those it does not satisfy I avoid meeting in the market. Candles dripped wax onto the pewter tray like softened vertebrae. Rumors evolved as rumors do. Faster than facts and more adaptably than rules. The town grew a handful of sayings that worked like talismans, even when they were nonsense. Close your mouth in the Whitlow lane. Mothers told children, or the house will learn your name. Breath carried caution like a secret folded in the cheek. Do not look through glass on a Sunday, a grandmother said, for glass remembers the Sabbath poorly. Folklore braided itself around fixtures. Count the nails, not the faces. An uncle said at a wake too near the rectory to be comfortable, and he made everyone repeat the numbers while the hymn ran in the next room. Counting sounded like prayer in a house of sorrow. Then one more thing changed, and it was not furniture or forms, but a posture in the people who thought they could master this with care and rules. Confidence sprained. At a funeral in August of 1874, where heat stood like a pain in the street, and every man's collar wilted, a boy in a short jacket stood at the back near the door, and never moved except to lift his eyes, once when the widow's wail struck a high note. Stillness broadcasts in a crowd. Afterward, when the room had emptied into the heat like wax out of a mold, the rector found the boy near the sideboard, looking at a fly that had trapped itself between pane and sash. He asked the boy if he needed water. The boy did not answer, and did not look at him, and when the rector glanced away to set the pitcher down, and then glanced back, the boy was simply gone into a corridor that did not lead outdoors. Corridors echo when no one is in them. From the rector's note to himself, written in a margin he later pasted over, cease to note sightings. They undo the work of sleep. Paste buckled the page where humidity got in. By late summer, families in outlying farms started holding their dead at home again, mistrusting any road that led through town, turning their sitting rooms into sudden sanctuaries with quilts tacked over windows and plates of food set on hall tables to occupy trembling hands. The old way published itself like a broadsheet. Embalmers who traveled with trunks and cheerful stories learned to keep their wagons rolling past the Whitlow lane without looking at the gate. Even commerce learned the local climate. In a municipal book, a clerk wrote the phrase, quietly suppressed, in relation to an unrelated matter, a failed petition about a fence, and later readers would wonder what exactly had been meant, because the words seemed to describe a mood, not a policy. Language was catching. If you walked down that street at dusk in those months, you would have felt it, a thickness, as if the air had acquired weight enough to press gently on your shoulders and invite you to hurry. Even crows flew a little higher over those shingles. The house itself adapted in small ways visible to no one but servants, and those who looked for such things. Doors rehung to close without a click, heavy rugs placed where boards had a memory of squeaks, curtains stitched with extra folds to drink sound. Silence was engineered like a craft, and all the while the chamber below, sealed twice now, once in the Whitlow's purpose, and once in the parish's fear, held still and taught stillness to the building above it. Stasis has instructions. The living adapted, the rules sharpened, the rumors upgraded themselves until they sounded like instruction, and the church managed as churches do when faced with both sacrilege and sorrow, by calling it prudence and naming it pastoral care. Names soothe until they don't, but the faces people claimed to see at the edge of rooms did not adapt, and that was the worst of it, because fear can learn a new habit, but the thing it fears refuses to age. Unchanging is its own threat. So the Whitlow house, now the rectory, now a place where the bell was not allowed to ring unless cold, kept receiving in a way no one could measure and no ledger could contain. Guests arrived without introductions. People crossed to the other side of the street if they heard the latch lift on a hot afternoon, and they did not look up when footsteps paused then continued, and they memorized the angle of the sun on the windows so they could be sure that what they saw inside was only their own shadow. Avoidance worked like prayer for a while, and in the parish office, under a square of glass that was never polished, the rector placed a small paper card that reminded him, without flourish, of the new order he had helped write. Do not invite reflection. Do not record what you will be made to deny. Do not trust stillness when it asks for a seat. The ink dried without a blot. By the summer of 1875, the rectory did not sit on the street so much as it occupied it, a wooden fact around which the town's grief and gossip orbited like cautious birds. Habit had hardened into law. The front gate's bell, though rarely pulled, started thoughts the way a trigger starts sound in a bell long after the clapper rests. Memory made noise without touching anything. Sundays brought 3 rhythms to Danville, now hymn, footfall, silence. The third weighed the most. Funeral processions adjusted as a matter of course, their routes sketched with detours that looked accidental to strangers and confessional to everyone else who knew the corner. The town walked a circle to avoid a square. In 9 months between late 1874 and early 1875, the parish recorded 52 funerals, 27 of which went the long way around the block, 14 that paused at the lane and then moved on without daring the gate, and 11 that demanded the family carry to the grave and witness the last spade. Numbers became medicine. In the rectory, Reverend Whitfield kept a new ledger separate from the old, ruled with narrow lines and small boxes, cross, hatched over names like a hedge around a garden, paper erected fences. He wrote sparingly to the bishop, and the bishop wrote even more sparingly back, each sentence a brick set to keep weather off a roof they both pretended did not leak. Correspondence became engineering. From Bishop A.'s letter to Reverend Whitfield, 7th of February 1875, guard scandal, preserve charity, minister to the living, do not excite inquiry, pray for our dead, both those properly buried and those whose rest is not as we would wish. Authority whispered and called it wisdom. The rectory adopted a cadence that resembled a drill. Bells tested at dawn, candles trimmed to equal height, curtains drawn halfway, then fully, then half again depending on the hour. Precision steadied trembling hands. Servants were taught steps like a catechism. Exactness subdued echoes. In the town, practical vigilance turned into a kind of ritual fervor, and then into culture, as if the county had been invaded by an idea rather than an army. The occupation was internal. Shopkeepers learned to avoid bright panes in their storefronts, and favored frosted glass, and painted signs that threw no reflections into the street. Light itself was domesticated. A rag and bottle man made his round with a sack that grew heavier each week. 8 dressing mirrors sold from worried homes in November alone, 10 more in December. 6 family-looking glasses traded for blankets as January hammered windows with ice. Reflection became a commodity to be exiled. At the churchyard, a quiet order held that pallbearers not only carry to the lip, but kneel to lay their hands on the lid as the first spade of earth struck, each palm a seal, each thumb a signature. Touch answered what sight could not. From Sheriff Tinsley's pocket notebook, between saddle mending and a list of nails, hands placed on lids, 12 of us today. Counted, said, remembered. We do what we can do. I sleep better in the nights I count. Counting forced breath to slow. Mothers began to burn small marks under coffin lids, 1 pinprick per child born in the house, so that if doubt ever rose in the night, someone could say, I marked her there, and believe it. Invisible signs did the work of courage. Carpenters met the mood like armorers, 4-turn screws instead of nails, brass plates engraved with name and date bolted inside, where only a man with a screwdriver could read them, special hinge pins pinned down like rivets. Hardware learned to defend. A Lexington embalmer learned to keep his tongue when passing the rectory, and to set his table in a village beyond, Because in Danville the smell of carbolic now argued with the smell of pitch embedded in imagination. Commerce bent to atmosphere. A local doctor presented a public lecture in the courthouse on effluvia and decay, and though he explained putrefaction and demonstrated lime's virtues with a calm jar and the vocabulary of chemists, the audience listened with their hands knotted and their eyes anywhere but on the glass. Science could not dislodge a story that had seen its own face. From notes scribbled by a schoolmistress in a blue ledger, February-March 1875, children instructed not to linger before windows, not to play with their reflections, taught instead to look at shoes and sleeves for description. Girls' ribbon colors, boys' scuffs on toes. We practice in the yard. I feel foolish and then less so. Education shifted to asymmetry. Numbers did their stamping work. 32 sealed glass cases counted and re-counted in the chamber before it was bricked a second time. 28 exact matches found in the county death ledger marked, buried. 2 graves opened and found to hold stones. Sermons that named the Whitlows aloud. 1 rule posted in the rectory, no mirrors. Statistics settled like beads on a string. Fear wore them like jewelry. The veiled woman returned because she never left, seen at a wake in March standing beside a stove that clicked to itself as iron contracts do when heat leaves them. The stove complained, the room did not. An old man swore the limping fellow had stood near the mantel at his cousin's funeral and had twitched at the exact same moment the cousin's widow had sobbed, as if their grief shared a pulley. Coincidence felt engineered. The boy with the untroubled hair occupied the doorway of the side chapel in April and watched the light through stained glass, as if he were counting red panes, then receded like tide down a corridor without turning. Vanishing became a habit. Reverend Whitfield, for whom words had once been both net and raft, wrote less and less in his journal, as if the effort of naming bled all usefulness from the names themselves. Language grew thin. From his journal, 18th April 1875. I have said the Lord knows so many times that I feel I am using his name to cover my own ignorance. Yet I am charged with peace, and peace sometimes looks like quiet. I stop up the cracks that let things sing. Candles smoked in the entries as if in sympathy. The house, obedient to both its old design and its new office, deepened its quiet the way a river deepens its channel. Stillness gained depth. Doors were hung so they closed with weight but without clap. Hinges soaked and wrapped to dull their voices. Runners waxed just enough to keep rugs from catching at shoes. Silence was manufactured with care. At night, when the street cooled and the last cart wheel's point faded from the ear, the rectory's rafters ticked and settled with the contentment of wood that knows it is being insisted upon. The building accepted its role. The town's economy even felt the pressure. Glaziers learned to offer frosted panes first. Tinsmiths discovered a market for dulling polish. Cabinet makers fielded orders for wardrobes with fabric panels where a mirror might have sat. Craft turned modest on purpose. One shopkeeper, who had hung a plate of glass as a fine display 3 summers prior, covered it with a muslin sheet that year and left a note pinned to the edge. For sale. He never lifted the muslin to show the shine. Commerce wore veils. If you asked parishioners in that season why the no mirror rule stood, they could give you a dozen small reasons that felt like virtue and not one large one that could bear inspection. Pride hid under prudence. An old woman said, "Mirrors call too much attention to what will go away," a phrase that sounded like wisdom passed for policy. From Minutes of Vestry, 6 June 1875, resolved that all wakes conducted under parish auspices shall be plainly furnished and briefly held, that the family shall appoint 1 member to sign the interment line, that the parish shall provide witnesses as needed. Procedure replaced confidence. Human cost walked subtle and constant lines alongside these arrangements. Men took to crossing the street not just at night, but even at midday to avoid the angle of the rectory's windows. Women found themselves staring at the blank where a mirror hung and losing their place in a verse. Children learned to measure rooms by echoes. Weariness sat down in their bones. A seamstress who worked off Hustonville Pike began to stitch black crepe as if it were her only cloth. her fingers learning its weight and oil so well that when she touched Lenin again she pressed too hard. Grief reshaped trade. A farmhand from out near Mitchellsburg refused to enter the rectory at noon on an errand and left his parcel on the step, then apologized later with his hat off for what he called unmannerly fear. Courtesy tried to survive. One afternoon in July, heat lay on the trunks of the elm trees like a visible rope, and a woman carrying bread passed the rectory's gate, paused at the clink of the bell's iron ring touching iron, a sound so light it might have been imagination, if not for the way the sound perched in the ear. Small noises became larger than they were. She stood, bread heavy in her arms, and told herself she would not look up at the second-story window where so many eyes had learned a new caution. She looked anyway. From her letter unsigned, left at the parish office, I saw nothing and thought I saw someone. I would have preferred the reverse. Confession borrowed wit to keep from crying. The house's dominance was not of the military kind. No barricades, no patrols, but a saturation, a practiced insistence that set the terms of attention and behavior for miles, occupation by suggestion. Even the clock in the hall learned to be shy, wound only half, full so that its tick would not strike too hard off the wall. Time moderated its voice. Men who would have mocked a ghost story 3 summers ago now developed small habits they pretended were for comfort. Touch wood before you enter the lane. Count steps under your breath between the curb and the gate. Do not pass at the stroke of the hour. Superstition became choreography. From a note pinned inside the vestry cabinet, written in the rector's hand but with no signature, do not let curiosity choose the hour of your errands. Attend to the living, and let stillness keep what it has been given. The paper browned as if it had weather inside it. Whispers named the strange pulse of anxiety that ran through the parish. Gist, sickness, a wry attempt to laugh at the feeling that the house itself expected, and accepted arrivals no one announced. Humor did reconnaissance and lost its nerve. A schoolboy counted pains on his morning walk and found, to his relief, that numbers did not look back. Numbers behave. Yet at the core of all this adaptation, the chamber remained mathematics beneath footboards, an equation solved to a constant 32 faces, sealed, named, unaging. A sum the town carried without wanting to. The rectory's unmirrored walls gathered seasons, spring's brush of rain, when the door was opened to air the hall, summer's dust when the lane baked, autumn's smell of apples on coats that passed on Sundays, winter's breath in the entry like a cloud that would not go outside. The house breathed other people's weather. If you stood across the street at dusk and watched the windows hold the day, a few beats longer than the walls, you could see the town's posture in miniature, light held back, then given over carefully, then withdrawn altogether. Even illumination obeyed, and in that compliance lay the cost, a community that had once met grief with noise, hymns, weeping. The bright talk that tries to crowd out emptiness had learned to meet it with systems and silence, and the suspicion that some guests do not leave just because they are not invited to stay. Resilience carried a shadow. The Whitlow house, now the rectory, ruled without saying so, its authority notarized by ledger lines and the weight of bricked arches and the absence of a mirror where a mirror would have hung. Domination achieved by omission. Everyone knew the rule. No one admitted why. And from this apex, this season when the house's habits had become the town's, it was clear that the address on that street had accomplished something armies sometimes failed to do. It had taken the high ground of the mind. The house belonged to them, and they belonged to the house. What settled over Danville in the mid-1870s was not a haunting so much as a supply chain, a lattice of iron, glass, paper, and habit that made the rectory a node in a wider, busier machine. The house breathed with the rhythm of factories it would never see. Up the Ohio and down the Kentucky, foundries poured and planed and hammered, and wagons rattled south from Cincinnati with crates labeled coffin furniture, hinges, screws, plates, and thumb turns. Industry learned the contours of grief. Catalogs arrived folded into themselves like accordions, printed from presses in Louisville and Cincinnati. Their pages online mokibl cassis, a and rpidbytgiss and ncofduskin ests snakal and a cloth blkhrp, bytherd. Choice wears a factory's perfume. The mid-century had introduced almond physics cast iron case, anthropoid, hermetically sealed, with a glass faceplate that promised the family a last look without contagion. The salesman's patter as polished as the iron's belly. Modernity advertised mercy in bolts, Cincinnati's Crane, Breed & Co., and other river, city makers learned the market quickly, turning out metal coffins and fittings that moved by riverboat and rail to towns that had once only known pine and a hand-sawn lid. Iron arrived where oak had been enough. Daneville did not buy many iron cases, but it bought ideas by the crate, absorbing the promise of glass and the authority of sealants into its own undertaker's workbench. Innovation, once courted, does not leave without leaving marks. Receipts in the Whitlow ledger, kept even as the family receded, listed tin rings, gutta percha cord, beeswax, pitch, and a new bracket for a cooling board purchased from a Louisville ironmonger whose billhead showed a little factory with too many windows. Materials multiplied better than vows, from an invoice saved under a loose floorboard and later copied into the parish file. 6 dozen coffin screws brass, 3 dozen coffin plates blank, 2 kegs of cut nails, 12 yards crepe, 2 pounds wax of bees, 1 tin of pine pitch, 4 lengths leather gasket. Each item felt like a rung on a ladder the town could not climb down. Adams Express wagons brought crates with stencils, still damp from the depot, and a boy with a pencil copied down the waybill number like a talisman. Logistics spoke a language everyone learned. The ice trade underwrote half the work. Winter cut and stored in pits or bought from men who hauled it from river ice houses, with hay packed around blocks that sweated in the Kentucky heat. Cold kept time when words could not. Blocks creaked on hooks slung from wagons, dropped into cellar chests that breathed white, and hissed against wet linen, as if disagreeing with the heat above. Physics took sides in the parlor. On the road, iron-rimmed wheels and iron axles pulled hearses with a crisp clicking that made the street's stones sound like an abacus. Metal counted even when men forgot. The war had taught a different technology, embalming, showy and chemical, with traveling embalmers bragging of faces returned intact after 500 miles and 2 summer suns on the rails. Chemistry promised distance without a racing cost. Dr. Thomas Holmes's reputation crossed into Kentucky by story if not by bottle, and druggists stocked arsenicals, and then other fluids as fashion and law shifted, all of it smelling like sharp salvation. The century learned to stall decay with recipes that whispered of laboratories and trains. Undertaker training, still informal, started to settle into method by the end of the decade. Auguste Renouard printing a manual before the century's close, mortuary schools in Ohio rising on the other side of 1873. But even now, in the rectory's shadow, practice marched ahead of doctrine. Instruction trailed the market by a mile. The rectory's strength came to mimic this cadence: new forms, new boxes, new rituals, the bureaucratic equivalent of a casting line, names poured and cooled and stamped and stacked. Paper became the house's steel. From minutes of vestry 15th November 1874, resolved that interment forms be doubled and countersigned, that a second witness be assigned from parish rolls, that all candles, cloth, and fittings be procured through one office. Decisions clinked like coins hitting a drawer. The telegraph office tapped the town's nerves when the bishop in Lexington needed a word, when the supply house in Louisville promised delivery, when the undertaker 3 counties over asked, in fighter's code, if anyone else had heard of sealed glass in a basement. Electricity carried rumors faster than hymnody. Bod enrodui stio pr per ic stio pleti enrevied Tuesday. One message read across the clerk's desk at the depot, the clerk's pencil catching briefly on the word, body, as if the current itself had snagged. Wires invented a shorthand for sorrow. At the hardware store near the courthouse, the proprietor rearranged his front window, moving plows behind the counter and putting coffin screws and plates within hand's reach, because he had learned which items caused men to lower their eyes and count coin quickly. Commerce adjusted its gait. Coffin plates, soft metal blanks ready for a name and date gouged in by hand, stacked like biscuits in brown paper, each one an invitation to order. Names could be manufactured on demand. Best thumb, screws, turned, with a scutcheon, per dozen, the proprietor wrote on his card. The neat lettering at war with the fact that the dozen would be gone by Friday. Supply learned the rhythm of loss. Glassmakers upriver shipped panes, cut small and thick, playful with green and bubbles, and a man with a wagon whose son had died in 49 found himself in 1875 telling customers he no longer carried mirrors. The town traded brightness for calm. From a letter out of Louisville, December 1874, addressed to Whitlow House, before the name changed on the gate. Per your order, glass plates oval 2 dozen, pitch 1 tin, gutta, percha 2 coils, gasket leather 4 feet, beeswax 2 pounds, instructions enclosed for warming and setting. Even instructions felt like commands. Not all the metal came on purpose. Some of it arrived as law. Ordinances crept into being that required coffins to be sealed for transport through town, that discouraged wakes exceeding a certain hour, that recommended lime at the grave. Regulation hammered where persuasion faltered. Interments within town limits discouraged by board. Announced a line in the county paper, after a reformer sent in a clipped report from England on the health dangers of intramural burial. Edwin Chadwick's words boiled down and Americanized. Sanitary logic joined the arsenal. In the churchyard, men shoveled lime from barrels into hollows where water stood, the powder rising and settling like a ghost of its own. Even dirt received treatment. Transport improved courage by complicating it. Rail timetables widened where wagons had worn narrow, and hearses could be met by cars with springs that promised a velvet ride, their iron leaf squeaking in relief at the concept of good roads. Progress added polish to dread. From Sheriff Tinsley's notebook, folded into the parish file after his death. Why lose one? We lose him forever, meaning trust, not man, because the man is already lost. A missing name, a missing nail, a missing hand at a lid. These are the blank spaces we cannot fill. The sentence sat like a dropped horseshoe. Undertakers in nearby counties sent postcards with square, unapologetic handwriting. We are asked now for glass more than for satin. One wrote, and I do not fancy it but I sell it. Trade had learned to keep 2 ledgers, conscience and cash. The rectory placed bulk orders for candles with the church supply house in Lexington. Tapers of beeswax preferred over tallow, steady burn preferred over sputter, down to the gross so that no family would find the flame failing at an ugly moment. Flame was standardized. Black crepe moved by the bolt, and the seamstress's thimbles wore thin spots where grief kept catching thread. Cloth developed muscle. Silas Hodges's Portland cement, harder, tighter, newer, cured into the arch's second skin with a chemistry that turned mud and grit into a single idea. The wall ceased to be a wall and became intention. Portland sets under water, he had said, proud as any maker, his trowel edge ringing faintly on a brick face, and for the first and only time in his long work he felt he was burying a room. Pride shares a boundary with sorrow. The house above took the change and translated it into domestic detail door hardware, chosen heavy and quiet. Iron curtain rods with thick rings that whispered instead of sang, drawer pulls that did not rattle when a hand trembled. Steel learned to be discreet. Even handwriting hardened. Reverend Whitfield's script moved from looping confidence to narrow strokes that looked like small bars laid over names, each letter a brace against collapse. Calligraphy took on armor, an avalanche is not always loud. Sometimes it is a long roll of increments, screws, orders, stamps, routines that pile until they cannot be moved by a single pair of arms. Momentum outlives motive. From the account book of a merchant on Main Street, sold, no, 8 black buttons, see mourning, 3 cards, ribbon black, 6 yards, coffin plate, L blank, 1, thumb screws, 4. Lists became a liturgy nobody asked to memorize. In the same book, lower down, and later crossed out, looking glass, small, returned. Reflection had become contraband. Cemeteries outside town learned to widen their lanes, the rural cemetery movement spreading its grid. Oaks, maples, gravel, and the paperwork of plot ownership learned to carry a small stamp, perpetual. Promise tried hard to sound permanent. The rectory's refusal of mirrors became standard enough that visitors ceased to ask and simply noticed the way faces resolved in wood grain and the mat of plaster. Sight learned a different surface. When a train whistle blew out near the depot, and the sound ran down the street like iron singing to itself, the house did not flinch. It had been built now into the same hymn. Iron recognized iron. People said less and did more of the same, more carefully, more often, until their muscles learned the shape of caution and their hands forgot the old ways. Memory retooled. From a letter sent by a supply house in Cincinnati to the parish office, April 1875. We can offer favorable terms for regular orders of plates, screws, escutcheons, and other furniture. Payment 30 days from invoice, 2% off for settlement in 10. Note: glass for viewing plates packed in straw, handle with care. Quartzy paired itself with iron. In that gentle avalanche, you could feel the weight of all the decisions made to keep a story from breaking the surface of public air. Bricks chosen, paper printed, glass unpolished, candles ordered in great numbers, hands placed on lids. Omission cost the price of a small factory. There were men who thought this a victory, because the town did not fly apart and children played marbles in the dust and church bells still rang reassurance over roofs at 6. Survival loves simple proof, and there were men who understood that victory had been purchased with a discipline that had to be maintained daily, like a pump that needed priming each morning lest the water go to ground. Systems are jealous gods. Every hinge, every dowel, every bolt, every form added up to a climate, and climates cannot be argued with at the front door. Weather does not debate. The Whitlow house, now the rectory, stood at the confluence of craft and law and market, its quiet not an absence but the by-product of constant, organized work. Silence came with a bill of lading. When you walked past and felt your step become careful without your consent, it was not superstition, but the sum of 1,000 small, manufactured influences, the weight of brick and print and iron on a community's gate. The avalanche had settled and found its level. And beneath all of it, under the lintel stamped by a mason's trowel and the whitewash rolled flat by a parish hand, the chamber waited in its engineered dark, unblinking behind glass that caught no reflections, because none were permitted to fall. The machine above had learned how to run, and the machine below had taught it how.